The US Navy currently has over 3,700 aircraft, making it the second biggest air force in the world by itself. In other words, the US Navy by itself, without the US Air Force or the Army, has more aircraft than any of the other air forces in the entire world, with the sole exception of Russia. This includes countries like China, India, South Korea, and Japan. Not only is the US Navy the second biggest air force in the world currently, but it also is one of the oldest air forces. US naval aviation was really kicked off by the aviator Glenn Curtiss, who was contracted by the US Navy to demonstrate that aircraft could take off from and land aboard a ship. And it was one of his pilots, Eugene Ely, that took off from a US ship in 1910. Later on, he would become the first pilot to ever land an aircraft on a ship in 1911. And interestingly enough, it's roughly the same technique that we use today. They built a runway on top of the ship with a series of ropes that were weighted down by sandbags that slowed the plane's momentum down. And although it's a little crude, we still use the same basic principle with arresting cables today on US aircraft carriers. These milestones demonstrated not only the potential but the inevitability of a US Naval Air Force. In fact, it sparked enough of an interest in a naval air force that on May 8, 1911, Captain Washington Irving Chambers made an order for the Navy's very first aircraft, the Curtiss A-1 Triad, inaugurating the official birth of US naval aviation. And just a short time later, in 1914, the first permanent naval air station was established in Pensacola, Florida, which happens to be the home of the National Naval Aviation Museum, which I highly recommend, and it also happens to be free, which makes it even better. But despite all the progress that had been made up until this point, in 1919, US naval aviation was almost halted entirely before it even really got rolling. There was a strong movement to entirely dissolve the US Navy's Naval Aeronautics program. One of the main advocates for maintaining the Naval Aeronautics program was actually the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, a man named Franklin Delano Roosevelt. At the time, there were other countries like the United Kingdom dissolving their naval aviation branches so that they could create an all-encompassing air force. Despite all the opposition, other countries dissolving their naval aviation branches, US naval aviation continued forward, and in 1922, the first US aircraft carrier was born. Up until this point, the Navy was primarily using seaplanes they called float planes that would be launched from the ships, but they would land on the water and then be recovered later with a crane. But just a mere 11 years after the first aircraft entered service in the US Navy, they decided to convert an old ship named the Jupiter into the very first US aircraft carrier, the USS Langley. This was a giant leap forward for US naval aviation. This allowed the US Navy to learn tons of lessons about how to efficiently operate a carrier. And just 5 years later, many of these lessons were implemented in the next generation of aircraft carriers in the USS Lexington and Saratoga. One of the most notable lessons that were learned from the USS Langley was the need for an elevator. The next evolutionary step for the US Navy was the development of radar, which entirely changed the game for the US Navy. And with the US entering World War II, this technology finally had its time to shine. This technological stride paved the way for the morning of May 7th, 1942, with the very first naval battle in history where both sides never fired directly upon one another and were nowhere near visual range of the other. And not only that, but it was also history's very first battle between two different aircraft carriers, that is, the Battle of Coral Sea. Not only did this battle mark a new era in naval warfare, but it also played a pivotal role in the US turning the tides in the Pacific theater. In the battle, both sides sustained heavy damages, but the US was able to cripple two of their aircraft carriers, which prevented them from joining in the Battle of Midway. And while these two superpowers continued to slug it out in the Pacific theater, the Allies had been dealing with a persistent threat in the Atlantic Ocean as well. And that specific threat was the threat of the U-boats. These Axis U-boats have been a constant threat against almost any Allied vessel in the North Atlantic. This threat forced the US Navy to have to develop a brand new type of warfare to protect not only its own fleet, but civilian vessels from U-boat attacks. The Navy determined at the time that one of the best strategies against the U-boats was actually especially with aviation. US naval aviation contributed to 60% of the captured and or destroyed U-boats at the time. And of course, that 60% figure doesn't consider how much of an impact aviation had on deterring the U-boat threat. And that's because the patrol planes overhead day and night would prevent the U-boat skippers from getting into a good position for a clear shot on the fleet. And to this day, this type of warfare is a huge part of the US Navy. Today, it's referred to as anti-submarine warfare. I actually learned about anti-submarine warfare from a very young age because my dad flew P-3s. For decades, the P-3 was the US Navy's sub-hunter. But I won't go into too much detail about anti-submarine warfare right now because I'm planning on covering it in a future video. Post-World War II brought a brand new aircraft fleet to the US Navy, both in fixed-wing aircraft and with the introduction of helicopters. From 1949 forward, the US Navy finally had production jet aircraft. Some of the jets that were prevalent for the US Navy at the time included the F-9F Panther and the F-2H Banshee. Both of these aircraft proved to be effective and long-term solutions for the US Navy. But possibly even more importantly, it ushered in a brand new era for naval aviation. They opened the door for aircraft such as the famous F-4 Phantom, the F-14 featured in Top Gun, the multi-role F-18 Hornets, which are currently being phased out in place of the F-18 Super Hornets, and the F-35s. And as for non-fixed-wing aircraft, helicopters have entirely replaced the float planes of US Navy past. In fact, today approximately half of naval aviators fly helicopters. The US Navy has become unquestionably the most powerful naval air force in the entire world. The Navy's fleet of aircraft has become a vital part of the US defense strategy. Its fleet of fighter, cargo, patrol, and multi-role aircraft have proven themselves time and time again in countless theaters across the entire world. And they will continue to do so even as the battlefield evolves. So if you found this video interesting and you want to learn more about aviation, past, present, and future, please consider subscribing to Aviation Austin. Thank you so much for watching, and Godspeed.